Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're headed to India.
India.
Yep, India. We're going to unpack a pretty interesting legal battle that ended up in the Indian Supreme Court.
Oh, wow, the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so this case, OPG Power Generation Private Limited via Nexio Power Cooling Solutions, India, Private Limited in Anner. It's all about this contract dispute over an air-cooled condenser unit.
Sounds kind of dry.
Oh, it's anything but. It's a real rabbit hole of contract law and limitation periods.
Limitation periods, like deadlines.
Exactly, like deadlines for legal stuff. And there's a really interesting twist involving meeting minutes.
Meeting minutes. That doesn't sound very exciting.
Trust me, in this case, it's a perfect example of how these tiny details can make or break a case, and not just in India.
So this is something that could happen to anyone dealing with contracts anywhere.
You got it. So let's get into it. OPG Power Generation, they're, well, as you can probably guess, a power generation company in India.
Makes sense.
They needed a new air-cooled condenser unit, and Nexio, a company that specializes in cooling solutions, won the bid to provide it.
Seems pretty straightforward so far.
Oh, but here's where it gets a little messy. OPG's holding company, Gita Power, was initially involved. Like, they issued the purchase orders for the unit.
Oh, okay.
But then later on, OPG confirmed those same orders with identical terms.
So you had two companies basically saying the same thing.
Yeah, and you can see how that might cause some confusion down the line about who's really responsible.
Definitely. And I'm guessing that's exactly what happened.
You bet. And to make things even more interesting, the project got delayed.
Uh-oh. Delay's never good.
And OPG was not happy about it. They ended up issuing what are called debit notes against Nexio.
Debit notes. What are those?
It's basically like a bill or a demand for payment. In this case, they were for things like liquidated damages, a penalty for finishing late and unpaid customs duty.
Okay, I'm starting to see where the conflict is brewing.
Right. And this is where this idea of limitation periods becomes super important.
Limitation periods, you mentioned those earlier.
Yeah. In a lot of legal systems, including India's, there are deadlines for when you can file legal claims. OPG tried to use this to their advantage. They argued that Nexio's claims for payment were invalid, like they filed too late based on when the work was supposed to be done.
Ah, so OPG was saying, hey, you took too long to ask for your money, so tough luck.
Exactly. But the court didn't buy that argument.
Really? Why not?
Well, the court said the key date wasn't when the project was supposed to be done, but when Nexio actually finished everything they were obligated to do, including, get this, a performance guarantee period.
A performance guarantee period. What's that?
It means Nexio had to make sure the unit actually worked right for a certain amount of time after they installed it.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't enough just to drop off the equipment and say, see ya.
Nope. They had to stick around and prove it actually worked. And you know what ended up saving Nexio from potentially losing a lot of money?
I bet it has something to do with those meeting minutes you mentioned.
Bingo. It's a real plot twist. You see, the court found that minutes from a meeting between OPG and Nexio actually acknowledged that Nexio was owed money.
Oh, wow. So they kind of admitted they were in the wrong.
Yeah, and that seemingly minor detail, those meeting minutes, well, they were enough to reset the clock on that limitation period under Indian law.
So OPG basically admitted they owed Nexio money and then tried to use a technicality to get out of paying.
Pretty much. And it totally backfired on them. This case really shows how important it is to keep good records, even for things like meetings.
Yeah, you never know what might end up being important later on, right?
Absolutely. All right, so we've set the stage. OPG is in a bit of a pickle thanks to some poorly timed debit notes and those fateful meeting minutes. But this is just the beginning, folks. The legal battle is far from over.
Buckle up, because we're going even deeper into this legal maze.
Okay, so let's talk about the more technical legal stuff, but try to keep it understandable for everyone, right?
Of course. So this whole case really hinges on this thing called the Indian Limitation Act of 1963.
The Limitation Act, yeah. What is that exactly? I mean, why is it so important here?
Well, think of it like a set of rules that set deadlines for different types of legal claims.
Deadlines, got it.
Yeah. And these deadlines, they're called limitation periods. And they exist in a lot of legal systems around the world, not just India.
So why have these deadlines? What's the point?
Well, the idea is to be fair to everyone involved. Like, you don't want people bringing up really old complaints years later when maybe the evidence is gone or people don't remember things clearly.
Makes sense. It's about keeping things efficient, too, right?
Right, exactly. It keeps the legal system running smoothly.
So in this case, OPG was trying to use this Limitation Act to say Nexio waited too long to ask for their money.
That's exactly it.
But the court didn't agree with them.
Nope, they didn't.
And part of the reason was how they classified the work that Annexio did.
Right. You're catching on. OPG was trying to argue that there are actually two separate things going on here.
Two separate things, huh?
They said because the contract involved the actual physical condenser unit, right, the goods,
Okay, the good.
and then the installation and setup, the services.
Ah, so they were trying to separate the goods from the services.
Precisely. And they were pointing to specific parts of the Limitation Act that deal with selling goods and providing services separately.
Sounds like a sneaky way to get out of paying.
You could say that,
Mm.
but the court wasn't fooled.
What did they say?
They looked at the bigger picture. They said this was all one project with one clear goal:
What goal?
to get this cooling unit designed, manufactured, delivered, installed, and working properly. It wasn't just about delivering parts, it was about delivering a complete working system.
Makes sense when you put it that way.
Right. So the court basically said it's not about separating the goods and services, it's about the overall purpose of the agreement.
Okay, so they weren't buying OPG's argument.
Nope. And based on that, they decided a different part of the Limitation Act applied, one that covers breaches of contract.
And that ended up helping Annexio's case.
Big time. It really backfired on OPG.
So what about those counterclaims we talked about before? Some were thrown out because they were too late, but some were considered by the court. Why was that?
Good question. The court made it clear that counterclaims, they're independent actions. They have their own separate limitation periods.
So just because OPG was responding to Annexio, it doesn't mean they get to ignore deadlines.
You got it. Each counterclaim is like its own mini lawsuit.
Interesting.
And in this case, remember those meeting minutes?
Yeah.
They ended up being super important again.
Oh, those meeting minutes, they're like the MVP of this case.
Right, because those minutes basically created a legally binding acknowledgement of certain debts and obligations.
So the counterclaims that got rejected, they weren't mentioned in those minutes.
Exactly. Another detail that had huge consequences for OPG.
It's crazy how these little things can make such a big difference.
Absolutely. This case just goes to show that what you put in writing, even something as simple as meeting minutes, can have a huge impact down the line.
It's like a legal time bomb. You never know what's going to blow up later.
Right. Oh, and there's one more twist to this story. Remember how persistent OPG was in fighting the arbitrator's decision?
Yeah, they didn't give up easily.
Well, one of their arguments was really interesting. They tried to bring up the concept of public policy.
Public policy. Ooh, that sounds complicated.
It can be. Basically, they were arguing that the arbitrator's decision was so messed up, like so out of line with Indian law and basic fairness, that it should be thrown out because it went against public policy.
So they're saying the decision wasn't just bad for OPG, it was bad for everyone.
That's the gist of it. They were trying to make it seem like the decision would harm the public good, not just their own company.
Bold move. Did it work?
Not even a little bit. The court said, yeah, okay, public policy is a valid reason to challenge a decision, but it's not a free pass to overturn any decision you don't like.
Makes sense. You can't just yell, public policy, and get your way.
Right. The court said they only interfere with decisions like this in very rare extreme cases. Like if the decision totally ignores basic fairness or disregards rulings from higher courts or goes against laws that protect the public, they're basically like, OPG, you need to show us how this decision is actually hurting everyone, not just you.
And OPG couldn't do that.
Nope. Their argument fell flat.
So not only did that argument fail, it kind of made them look bad, right? Like they were
Yeah.
desperate.
Yeah, it wasn't a good look. They might have had a better chance if they had focused on stronger arguments.
This all sounds so complicated. I mean, I can't even imagine going through this whole process.
Contract law can be a real headache, that's for sure. This case really shows how important it is to have a good lawyer on your side, especially early on.
Yeah, don't try this at home, folks.
Exactly. But I think we've done a pretty good job of explaining the main points so far.
Yeah, we've covered a lot. The contract, those all-important limitation periods, the meeting minutes, counterclaims, and even that public policy argument. What else is there to talk about?
There's actually one more interesting piece to this whole puzzle that we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, there's more. I thought we had covered it all. What else is there?
Well, remember how this whole thing started? Because OPG claimed Annexio's work was late?
Yeah, they were hit with all those debit notes for liquidated damages and customs duty.
Right. But what if the project wasn't actually late?
What do you mean?
Well, it turns out there were some disputes about whether those delays were actually Annexio's fault. Like there might have been some issues on OPG's end that contributed to the project timeline slipping.
Interesting. So maybe OPG was a little too quick to point the finger at Annexio.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really tricky. Because to figure out who's really responsible for the disease, you have to get deep into the weeds of the contract.
Oh boy, back to the contract.
Yeah. You got to look at things like deadlines, force majeure clauses, and all those little details that most people probably skip over.
It's like a legal scavenger hunt.
Exactly. And in this case, it seems like there were some gray areas in the contract that made it hard to pinpoint exactly who was responsible for what.
So even if OPG had been right about the limitation periods and all that, the whole question of whether Annexio actually breached the contract was still up in the air.
You got it. And that just goes to show how important it is to have a clear, well-written contract in the first place. Because when things go wrong, like they did in this case, it can be a real nightmare to untangle the mess and figure out who's responsible.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder for all of us to read those contracts carefully and make sure we understand what we're agreeing to. And maybe get a lawyer to look it over just in case, right?
Always a good idea. So, stepping back from all the legal details for a second, what do you think is the biggest takeaway from this case?
Honestly, I think it's a story about being prepared. You know, OPG might have avoided this whole ordeal if they had been more careful about documenting their dealings with Annexio and if they had really understood the ins and outs of their contract.
Totally agree. Being proactive and paying attention to the details can really save you a lot of headaches down the line.
For sure. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been quite a journey through the world of Indian contract law and the unexpected importance of meeting minutes.
Definitely a case we won't soon forget.
Well, folks, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and remember to always read the fine print.